The restaurant was one of those places people talked about in low voices. The lights were warm but soft, the kind that made everything feel expensive without trying too hard. Crystal glasses caught the light when guests lifted them. The air smelled of fresh bread, grilled meat, and something sweet. Every table was full. People had dressed carefully to be here, knowing this was not just dinner, but a statement. At the center table sat a man everyone recognized, even if no one said his name. His watch alone could pay for most of the meals in the room. His posture was stiff, his face tight, and his phone rested in his hand like a weapon. He had just ended a call that did not go his way. Anyone watching closely could tell he was angry, not loud angry, but the kind that sits under the skin and waits for a place to land. Around him sat business partners and guests who laughed a little too hard at his jokes. They leaned in when he spoke and nodded quickly. No one challenged him. No one corrected him. He was used to that. For years, people had learned that it was easier to agree with him than to cross him. Across the room, a young waitress moved quickly between tables. She had been on her feet since early morning. Her shift was supposed to end soon, but the restaurant was busy, and busy nights never followed the schedule. Her uniform was clean and pressed, though the fabric showed signs of many washes. She carried herself with quiet focus, checking orders twice, apologizing when she brushed past chairs, offering small smiles that came from habit more than mood. When the floor manager pointed her toward the center table, her stomach tightened. Everyone knew that table was difficult. Big spenders, big egos, and no patience. Still, she nodded and picked up her notepad. This was her job, and she took it seriously. She approached the table with calm steps and greeted them politely. Her voice was soft but clear. She listed the specials and waited for their order. Most of the guests barely looked at her. The man at the center glanced up once, then back to his phone. He ordered quickly without warmth. Others followed. She wrote everything down carefully, repeating each order to avoid mistakes. When she finished, she thanked them and turned to leave. A few minutes later, the kitchen slowed. A delivery had arrived late, and one dish needed extra time. She returned to the table to explain, keeping her tone respectful. She apologized for the delay and offered an alternative. That was when his eyes finally settled on her. He sighed loudly and leaned back in his chair. "Do you know who you're serving?" he asked, not really expecting an answer. She stayed calm. "Yes, sir, and I'm sorry for the wait." He waved his hand, dismissing her words. This place gets more expensive every year, yet the service keeps getting worse. His voice was loud enough for nearby tables to hear. The guests around him smiled awkwardly. No one defended her. She nodded again. "I understand your frustration. I'll check on it right away." She turned to go, but he wasn't done. He muttered something under his breath, then repeated it louder, this time switching to Mandarin. His tone changed. It wasn't just complaint now. It was mocking, sharp, meant to sting. He assumed she wouldn't understand. To him, it was a private insult spoken in public. A few people at the table stiffened. One guest understood the language and looked down at his plate. Another pretended not to hear. The room didn't go silent, but the energy shifted. There was a pause, like everyone sensed something uncomfortable had just happened. The waitress stopped. She stood still for a moment, her back to the table. Her shoulders lifted slightly as she took a breath. For a second, it looked like she might walk away and let it go. That would have been easier. But something in her expression changed. She turned back slowly, her face calm, her eyes steady. She looked directly at him, not with anger, not with fear, but with quiet control. Then she spoke. She answered him in Mandarin. Her pronunciation was clear, natural, not forced or broken. Every word landed exactly where it should. Her tone was polite but firm, the way someone speaks when they respect themselves. She addressed his complaint, corrected his assumption, and apologized again for the delay, all in the same language he had used to belittle her. For a moment, the man didn't react. His face froze, like his mind was trying to catch up with what had just happened. The people at the table slowly looked from her to him. A guest nearby stopped mid-sip. The billionaire's phone slipped slightly in his hand. She finished her sentence, gave a small, respectful nod, and waited. The silence felt heavy now. He cleared his throat and laughed once, short and sharp. "You speak Mandarin?" he asked, switching back to English. "Yes, sir," she replied simply. "Since when do waitresses learn Mandarin?" he said, raising an eyebrow. She didn't react to the word. "For some of us, learning languages is not a hobby," she said. "It's a necessity." That answer landed differently. He studied her for the first time, really looked at her. Not the uniform, not the role, but the person standing in front of him. There was nothing weak in her posture, nothing careless in her words. People around the table shifted in their seats. A few guests from nearby tables pretended to check their phones while listening closely. He leaned forward. "Interesting," he said. "Then tell me, where did you learn it?" She hesitated for a brief moment, not because she was afraid, but because the answer carried weight. "From life," she said. That wasn't the answer he expected. He smiled again, but this time it was thinner. "Life teaches Mandarin now?" She met his gaze. "Sometimes life teaches you things school never can." There was a pause. He could have laughed it off, could have waved her away, could have doubled down on his power. Everyone expected that. Instead, he said nothing. The kitchen bell rang in the distance. Plates were being prepared. The restaurant slowly returned to its normal rhythm. But something had shifted. She excused herself and went back toward the kitchen, her hands steady, her steps controlled. Only once she was out of sight did she let out the breath she had been holding. At the table, the billionaire sat back, his appetite suddenly gone. The anger from his phone call felt smaller now, replaced by something unfamiliar. For the first time that evening, he felt exposed, and he didn't like it, but he couldn't forget it either. The story between them had just begun. The restaurant carried on, the noise of conversation and clinking glasses filling the air. Yet, around the center table, a quiet tension remained, like an invisible thread pulled tight. The billionaire's mind kept replaying the moment. He had assumed she didn't understand him, that his words would intimidate her, that she would shrink under the weight of his anger. But she had not. She had met his words head-on, calmly, in the language he used to belittle her. That thought gnawed at him more than he wanted to admit. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the table, pretending to focus on the menu. He ordered more wine, as if to distract himself from the embarrassment, and try to reassert control by speaking to one of his business partners. But every glance toward the young waitress reminded him of the challenge he had not expected. Meanwhile, she moved among the tables, delivering dishes, taking new orders, and smiling at guests. No one watching could guess the storm brewing in her mind. She had faced difficult people before. She had learned, over the years, that anger often hides fear or insecurity. And sometimes, the people who try to make you feel small were themselves the ones feeling tiny inside. Her thoughts were calm but precise. She reminded herself that she was here to do a job, not to argue, not to lecture, not to prove herself for the sake of pride. Every word she spoke, every gesture she made, was part of her control. She knew the power of silence, and she knew the strength of a simple, confident reply. A few minutes later, she returned to the center table with a tray of drinks. She placed each glass carefully in front of the guests. The billionaire looked at her, and for a moment, there was a subtle acknowledgement in his eyes, a recognition that she was not just another server. But he quickly masked it with a smile, pretending nothing had happened. "You speak Mandarin very well," he said again, not as a challenge this time, but as a statement that demanded attention. She nodded politely. "Thank you, sir. I studied it for many years." "Studied it?" he asked, leaning forward. "And here you are serving tables?" Her expression didn't change. She set a bottle of wine on the table and replied softly, "Life takes us to many places we do not expect. Sometimes to serve, sometimes to lead, both require patience." He raised his eyebrows, clearly caught off guard. His tone was softer now, curious rather than mocking. No one in his circle had spoken to him in this way before. The boldness, the calm, the intelligence in her words, it unsettled him. One of the guests nudged him slightly, giving a quiet, conspiratorial glance. But he ignored it. He wanted to understand this, to see what made her different from everyone else he had met. That curiosity was new, unfamiliar, and slightly dangerous for him. It challenged the way he usually saw the world. She continued to serve with professional grace, moving to another table briefly, but always keeping an eye on him. She did not gloat, did not seek revenge, did not whisper to colleagues. She maintained her dignity. That quiet strength made her presence grow in the room. Guests began to notice, wondering about the calm woman who had just faced the billionaire's anger without flinching. Back at the center table, the billionaire found himself distracted. He had planned the evening carefully. It was meant to be about business, about showing control, about making statements to impress and intimidate. Yet here he was, unsettled by a single waitress. He tried to convince himself it was trivial, but the truth was uncomfortable. He respected her, and that respect was mixing with frustration. He asked another question, less sharp than before. "Where did you learn to speak like that?" She paused for just a moment, then replied with the same calm tone. "I learned from people, from books, from mistakes, from situations where I had no choice but to learn quickly." The billionaire leaned back, running a hand over his face. That answer, simple and honest, carried weight. It was not boastful. It did not seek admiration. It simply told the truth, and the truth had a power of its own. He shifted his focus for a moment to his business papers, tried to regain control of his mind and the evening. But he could not stop glancing at her, noticing how she moved gracefully among the tables, balancing trays, listening carefully to guests, remembering details without faltering. There was an elegance in her work, a pride in her craft that he had never noticed before in someone so young and unassuming. The minutes passed, and the atmosphere at the center table grew quieter. Conversations were polite, not because of the man's status, but because of the presence of the woman who had quietly commanded attention without raising her voice. It was a subtle shift, but one that was palpable. Other guests whispered, exchanging glances, realizing that the woman's dignity and calmness had changed the dynamic entirely. At one point, he asked her to explain a menu item in Mandarin to his colleague across the table. She did so effortlessly, using correct terms, correct tone, and complete sentences. He watched carefully as his colleague's eyes widened, impressed. For the first time, the billionaire realized that her skill was not just impressive. It was real, practiced, and earned. He felt a strange mix of pride and discomfort. Pride, because her skill reflected discipline, intelligence, and courage. Discomfort, because he had tried to humiliate her and failed, and now he was forced to acknowledge her strength. That acknowledgement was something he had rarely had to do in public. The waitress, sensing the shift, did not press further. She returned to other tables, checking orders, pouring water, attending to needs. She kept her focus outward, never showing any sign of pleasure at the effect she had caused. Her dignity remained intact. Her professionalism became a quiet lesson in confidence and strength. In his own mind, the billionaire started replaying his actions, the way he had spoken, the words he had used. He realized how easily he had assumed power over someone, and how fragile that sense of control could be. He began to question his assumptions, to see that respect could not be demanded, only earned, and that true strength often came in forms that did not look like power. Other guests began to see the scene differently. Some noticed the way she handled herself, the calm authority she exhibited. Some whispered to each other about her skill and confidence. The buzz was low, subtle, but it was there. A story was forming, a story about a young woman who had faced a man used to dominating every room, and who had emerged unshaken. As the evening progressed, the tension between them softened slightly, replaced by a mutual acknowledgement, not friendship, not alliance, but a recognition of intelligence, discipline, and character. For the billionaire, it was unsettling. For the waitress, it was simply part of doing her job well. She did not seek praise. She sought respect, and she had earned it. When the first plates were served, he tasted the food and found it excellent. He looked at her, nodding slightly, almost imperceptibly. She met his gaze with calm eyes, giving the slightest nod back. That small exchange carried more meaning than any words could have conveyed. He realized quietly that he had underestimated her, not just her skill, but her composure, her confidence, her intelligence. In that realization, a tiny crack appeared in the wall he had built around himself, the wall that relied on wealth and power to command obedience. He didn't like it, and yet he respected it. The waitress moved on to another table, continuing her work. She had handled the situation, not with defiance or anger, but with grace. She had turned an attempt at humiliation into a moment of revelation, for him, for the guests, and for herself. And in doing so, she had set the stage for a story that would not be forgotten by anyone who had witnessed it that night. As she walked away from the center table, she let her mind relax for a moment, but only briefly. The restaurant was still busy, the night long, and her work was far from over. Yet she carried herself differently now. Not proud, not boastful, but quietly strong, having faced one of the most challenging moments of her shift with dignity. The billionaire, left with a wine glass in hand, stared at the room and for the first time saw things differently. He had come expecting to dominate, to intimidate, to impress. Instead, he had been humbled, not harshly, not cruelly, but gently, by someone who had simply spoken her truth. That realization lingered, uncomfortable and enlightening, as he continued his evening. The night carried on, but the energy around the center table had shifted in subtle ways. The billionaire, once entirely confident in his control of the room, found himself quietly observing the waitress whenever he could. She moved among the tables with ease, her hands steady, her back straight, her smile calm. She did not act differently around him, and that simple consistency unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He watched her serve other guests, noticing the careful attention to detail. Each order repeated correctly, each plate delivered with perfect timing. It was as if she had anticipated every need before it was spoken. There was a skill in her movements, but also a patience that came from more than practice. It came from experience, from a life that had demanded her to carry responsibility long before she had wanted to. That thought made him pause. The billionaire tried to focus on the conversation with his business partner, but the words felt distant. His mind kept returning to the young woman who had faced him earlier. He remembered how calm she had been, how her voice had carried the authority of someone who had endured far more than she should have had to at her age. He realized that her confidence was not born from privilege. It had been earned through struggle, discipline, and resilience. And that was something he could neither command nor buy. At one point, he called her over again. This time, it was not an order, not to mock, but to ask for her opinion on a dish he was curious about. She approached the table and explained each element, describing flavors and ingredients. Her Mandarin was perfect, and when she switched to English to the guests who did not understand, her words were precise yet warm. He listened intently, more attentive than he had been with anyone in a long time. He found himself impressed, but also a little wary of the power of simple competence. He asked her another question, almost unconsciously. "Why are you here?" Her expression did not waver. "I have work to do," she said simply. That was the honest answer, and it carried a weight he had not anticipated. There was no bitterness, no attempt to lecture him, just honesty, the kind that comes from someone who knows her own worth and does not need to prove it through words or gestures. He leaned back, considering her answer. He wanted to dismiss it, to find some flaw, but he could not. She had integrity, intelligence, and composure, all wrapped in a quiet, unassuming presence. He realized that for the first time, he was being measured not by his wealth or status, but by his own conduct, and that realization made him uncomfortable. As the night progressed, the restaurant filled with the low hum of conversation. Guests moved in and out, laughter mixing with the clatter of plates. The young waitress moved gracefully among the tables, attending to each guest with the same careful attention. She did not dwell on what had happened at the center table, but she remained aware of the subtle shift in attention. People were watching her now, some admiring, some curious. The respect she earned was quiet but undeniable. The billionaire found himself studying her. He noticed how she carried herself, how she spoke to guests, how she managed the chaos around her without seeming overwhelmed. Each small action revealed competence and calm. He realized that her strength did not come from power, money, or authority. It came from experience, skill, and a deep understanding of herself and her world. He tried to understand her story, piecing together what little he could observe. He guessed that her life had not been easy. There was a sense of resilience in the way she moved, in the way she held herself. He imagined the sacrifices she must have made, the challenges she must have faced. That imagination brought with it a rare feeling for him. Humility. He recalled the moment she had responded to him in Mandarin. Her words had not been meant to humiliate, yet they had done so effortlessly. She had taken his arrogance and turned it on its head, not with anger or confrontation, but with calm intelligence. That moment lingered in his mind, more powerful than any insult he had ever delivered. The billionaire realized something else. He had underestimated people like her, people who did not have wealth, but had intelligence, skill, and dignity, people who could face arrogance with calm confidence, who could turn powerlessness into strength. It was a lesson he had rarely learned, and one that made him uncomfortable but also, in a strange way, intrigued. He asked another question, this time more cautiously. "Have you always worked here?" She smiled faintly. "No, sir. I have done many things. Life gives lessons in many forms. This is just one of them." Her answer was simple, yet it carried depth. It suggested that she had experienced hardship, that she had learned from it, and that she had carried that knowledge into her work. The billionaire felt a mixture of admiration and envy. Admiration for her resilience and skill. Envy because he had never faced life in a way that demanded such discipline and composure without the safety net of wealth. He watched as she returned to other tables, her attention focused, her movements precise. She did not seek acknowledgement, did not linger in the spotlight, did not demand recognition. Her power was quiet, subtle, and effective. That quiet power unsettled him more than confrontation ever could. He had grown used to controlling situations with wealth, status, and voice. Here was someone who controlled a room with dignity, skill, and presence alone. He realized that he had misjudged her entirely. She was not just a waitress, not just someone serving meals. She was a person with depth, intelligence, and experience that far exceeded the expectations of anyone who had underestimated her. And he, with all his wealth and power, had been humbled by a simple, calm exchange of words. The rest of the night passed with the usual rhythm of the restaurant. Orders were taken, and dishes delivered, and guests chatted quietly. But the center table remained different. The billionaire had changed, in small ways. He no longer felt the need to dominate. He observed quietly, listened carefully, and, for the first time in a long while, allowed himself to be reflective. He noticed the respect she earned from others, even in the simple way guests looked at her, listened to her, and responded politely. He realized that her influence was not loud, not demanding, but profound. It was a quiet assertion of competence and dignity that left a lasting impression on everyone who witnessed it. By the end of her shift, the young waitress had left an impression that could not be ignored. The billionaire, usually accustomed to controlling every narrative, had been confronted with something unexpected. Real skill, real intelligence, and real composure, all wrapped in one person who did not seek to impress, only perform her duty with grace. He sat in his chair, finishing his drink, reflecting on what happened. The evening had not gone as planned. He had intended to assert power, to intimidate, to dominate. Instead, he had been humbled, not harshly or publicly, but gently, by someone who had spoken truth, handled herself with dignity, and remained unshaken. The realization was uncomfortable, yet enlightening, and in that quiet moment, he understood something fundamental. Respect is earned through character, skill, and composure, not wealth, status, or arrogance. He had witnessed it firsthand, and it had left an indelible mark on him. It was a lesson he would not forget, a memory that would shape the way he saw others and, perhaps, himself. The restaurant began to quiet down as the night wore on. The last of the late diners were finishing their meals, conversation softening, chairs scraping lightly against the polished floors. Yet the energy around the center table remained charged, though it had shifted from tension to something more complex. The billionaire, once full of anger and impatience, now found himself reflective, studying the young waitress as she moved effortlessly through the remaining tables. Every gesture she made was precise, every word careful and calm. Her professionalism had not wavered, and that constancy unsettled him more than confrontation ever could. He recalled the moment when she had answered him in Mandarin. The clarity of her voice, the correctness of her tone, and the quiet confidence in her words had left him speechless for the first time in years. He had expected to assert power with wealth, reputation, and volume. Instead, she had met him with honesty, dignity, and skill. That memory played over in his mind like a mirror, reflecting an unfamiliar truth about himself. He realized that he had underestimated people like her, individuals whose strength and intelligence were invisible to most, yet unmistakable when revealed. The young waitress moved to another table, taking orders, offering suggestions, and listening intently. Her attention was fully on the guests, yet the subtle shift she had caused at the center table could not escape him. He watched the way she smiled gently while explaining a dish, how her eyes followed needs of diners without appearing rushed. Each action demonstrated care and competence, and he felt a stirring of admiration that he did not want to acknowledge. Curiosity overtook his pride. He called her over, this time without any trace of his earlier arrogance. "Can you tell me more about this dish?" he asked, genuinely interested. She nodded and explained the ingredients, the preparation, and the flavors. Her Mandarin was flawless, and she switched to English effortlessly when necessary. The billionaire listened intently, realizing that her knowledge was not just learned, but mastered through experience. She had an understanding that went beyond the surface, a depth that he could not command with wealth alone. He leaned back in his chair, reflecting on his assumptions. He had believed that money and influence could control every situation, that fear and intimidation were enough to command respect. Yet here was a woman with no title, no fortune, who had taught him a lesson without raising her voice. He felt a strange mix of humility and frustration. Humility, because he had witnessed real skill and dignity. Frustration, because he had been unprepared for it and had no immediate way to reassert the dominance he was accustomed to. "Why did you learn Mandarin?" he asked, genuinely curious. He expected a rehearsed answer, a story meant to impress or justify. But she simply smiled and replied, "Life required it. There were opportunities one could not miss, and lessons I had to learn quickly." Her words were simple but profound. They hinted at struggle, sacrifice, and resilience without claiming attention or pity. He felt the weight of her experiences pressing lightly against his consciousness. He realized that for every moment she stood before him, she carried a lifetime of discipline, patience, and strength that he had taken for granted in his own life. As she returned to other tables, he noticed how other guests reacted. People whispered quietly, admiring her poise, the calmness she maintained in a busy environment, and the skill with which she managed both her work and the subtle dynamics of the room. The respect she earned was quiet, unobtrusive, but unmistakable. He had never seen influence take such a form, not loud or commanding, but inherent in presence and competence. He thought about his earlier behavior, the words he had spoken, the arrogance he had displayed. For the first time, he felt a twinge of guilt. He realized that his attempts to assert superiority were unnecessary, cruel, and ultimately ineffective. The waitress had handled him with patience and intelligence, turning his own assumptions against him without confrontation. Her composure had humbled him, and that humility was unfamiliar, yet enlightening. He shifted his focus inward, contemplating the way he had used power and wealth to shape his world. He saw the emptiness in that approach, the fragility of dominance based on fear and status. Watching her, he understood that true authority came from character, skill, and the ability to face challenges without resorting to intimidation. He recognized that respect must be earned, not demanded, and that it often came from places he had never looked before. As the last orders were prepared and the final plates delivered, he called her back once more. "Tell me something about yourself," he said, this time with genuine interest rather than curiosity laced with arrogance. She looked at him calmly. "I have learned from life, from work, and from people around me. I have faced challenges, made mistakes, and grown. I do not seek recognition, only to do my work well." Her answer was honest, direct, and free of pretense. It carried a quiet authority that demanded acknowledgement without demanding submission. He listened, absorbing the lesson she had delivered without ever raising her voice, without ever stepping out of her role. It was a subtle form of power, one he could not have predicted and could not easily counter. He felt a shift inside himself. He realized that this night, meant to assert dominance, had instead become an opportunity for introspection. He had encountered someone who had turned his assumptions upside down, who had challenged a perception of strength and intelligence, and who had demonstrated that true dignity is inherent, not granted by status or wealth. That realization was uncomfortable, but necessary. The young waitress finished her shift, moving with the same calm efficiency she had shown all evening. She had handled every interaction with grace, had responded to challenges with intelligence, and had maintained her dignity throughout. The influence she had exerted was not loud or visible to all, but it left a mark on everyone who had witnessed it, especially the billionaire at the center table. He sat back in his chair, finishing his drink slowly. The restaurant around him continued its quiet rhythm, but he felt the weight of what had transpired. The lesson was clear. Humility, respect, and genuine skill carry a power that cannot be matched by wealth or status alone. He understood that he had been humbled, not through confrontation or failure, but through observation, patience, and the quiet strength of another person. As he left the restaurant, he glanced back once at the young waitress. She was moving through the tables, attending to guests, unaware of the deep impression she had left on him. In that moment, he realized that the evening had changed him. It had reminded him of the value of respect, the weight of integrity, and the quiet authority that comes from competence and composure. And he knew that he would carry that lesson forward, perhaps reconsidering the way he approached power, people, and the world around him. The restaurant had grown quiet now. Most of the guests had left, leaving only a few lingering at their tables. The soft hum of conversation and the occasional clink of glass filled the air, but the night carried a calm sense of completion. The young waitress moved with the same careful attention she had all evening, clearing tables, folding napkins, and making sure nothing was left unattended. Her shift was nearly over, yet she remained composed, as if nothing had happened at all, even though the events of the evening had left a mark far beyond the dining room. At the center table, the billionaire sat back, finishing the last of his wine. He had been quiet for some time, lost in thought. The earlier events replayed in his mind. Her calm replies, the way she had spoken Mandarin perfectly, the dignity and strength she had carried without boasting or showing anger. He realized that for the first time in a long while, he had been humbled in a genuine, meaningful way, not by failure, not by a competitor, but by a single person who had simply done her work with intelligence, patience, and grace. He called her over once more, this time not as a challenge, not as an order, but as a gesture of genuine interest. "I want to apologize," he said quietly. The words surprised even him, but they were sincere. "I spoke harshly before. That was wrong." The waitress looked at him, her expression calm, her eyes steady. "Thank you, sir," she said simply. She did not smile or show pleasure. Her acknowledgement was quiet but dignified, carrying the weight of understanding without making him feel embarrassed or defensive. He shifted slightly, uncomfortable with the vulnerability that came from admitting wrongdoing. Yet the moment was necessary. He wanted to recognize what had happened, to face it honestly, because he could feel the weight of the lesson she had imparted without ever intending to teach it. "You have a talent," he said after a pause. "Not just in language, but in the way you carry yourself. That is rare." Her expression did not change. She inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement, as if to say that she did not need praise, but understood its meaning. It was a lesson in humility for him. Not to expect validation for every skill, not to demand respect through fear, but to recognize it when it naturally appears through competence and dignity. He watched her move back toward the remaining tables, still focused, still patient, still in control. He realized that her power was quiet, subtle, and undeniable. It came from experience, skill, and integrity, and it had changed his understanding of authority and respect. As the final guest prepared to leave, he stood up and approached the manager. He asked for her contact information, not for business, not for favors, but to express his gratitude and admiration formally. He wanted to ensure that the recognition she deserved would reach her beyond the walls of that restaurant, beyond the events of that evening. When the young waitress returned to the center table briefly, he handed her a card. "This is for you," he said, "not as charity, but as acknowledgement. You have taught me something I will not forget." She accepted it gracefully, her hand steady, her gaze calm. "Thank you, sir," she replied again. There was no expectation, no demand, only acknowledgement. She understood the weight of her actions and the subtle influence she had exerted. The billionaire left the restaurant soon after, but the evening remained vivid in his mind. He realized that humility and respect were not just concepts but lived experiences. The lessons of the night would shape the way he approached people, situations, and power in the future. He had been reminded that intelligence, patience, and dignity often outweigh wealth, status, or authority. The young waitress returned to the back of the restaurant to finish her shift. She did not dwell on the acknowledgement, the subtle shifts in the room, or the impact she had made. She carried herself with the same calm composure, the same quiet strength, as if she had done nothing extraordinary. Yet everyone who had witnessed the events knew differently. The lesson she had given was simple, human, and powerful. True strength is quiet, dignity is earned through action, and respect is granted to those who embody integrity. As the lights dimmed and the last guest left, the restaurant settled into stillness. The young waitress wiped down the final table, stacked the chairs, and prepared to leave. Outside, the night air was cool and calm. She walked to the door, carrying her bag, her movements deliberate, her presence quiet yet commanding. She had faced an unexpected challenge, met it with grace, and left a lasting impact without ever seeking to impress or dominate. The billionaire, as he drove away, reflected on the evening. He understood now that power is not always about control, that intelligence and dignity cannot be purchased, and that a single person, acting with honesty, composure, and skill, could teach a lesson that money and status never could. It was a memory he would carry, a story that would shape his perspective, and a moment of humility that would remain long after the night ended. The lesson was clear. True authority does not demand fear. True strength does not shout, and true respect is earned through character and action. In the quiet of the restaurant, in the simple interactions between a billionaire and a young waitress, those truths had been made visible, and in that visibility lay a profound, human story, one that would resonate far beyond the walls of that restaurant and the events of one extraordinary night.